November 12th, 1970. Around 10 o'clock at night, the islands of the Ganges Delta, in what was then East Pakistan, future Bangladesh. Kerosene lamps were going out inside low wooden homes. Fishermen were securing their boats. Families were putting their children to bed. Rain surprised no one here. Even powerful winds were part of life along the Bay of Bengal. But that night, the familiar sounds began to change. The gusts grew heavier. Doors started to shake. Livestock pulled nervously against their ropes. Somewhere, radios were broadcasting warnings about a cyclone, but on the remote islands, many people never heard them. And those who did could not understand how close the danger had already come. They were warned about the wind. They closed their windows, reinforced their roofs, and stayed inside. Almost no one realized that the greatest threat was not approaching through the air. It was rising from the sea. Within hours, the water would turn this night into one of the deadliest disasters in human history. 4 days earlier, an area of low pressure had formed over the warm waters of the Bay of Bengal. At first, it looked like another tropical disturbance, one of many that appear after the monsoon season. But the system began organizing rapidly. The warm ocean fed it with moisture. Thunderstorms tightened around its center. Atmospheric pressure continued to fall. By November 11th, satellite images showed a well-organized cyclone moving north. Meteorologists could see the danger. But between a forecast and a person living on a distant island stood an enormous gap. Weak communications, few radios, almost no roads, limited boats, and a severe shortage of shelters. Some warnings arrived too late. Others sounded too familiar to residents who had already survived many storms. And Bhola did not appear to be a record-breaking cyclone in terms of wind speed. According to modern estimates, its strength was roughly equivalent to a Category 3 hurricane. Devastating, but far from the most powerful tropical storm possible. That became the fatal illusion. The real catastrophe was being prepared not only by the cyclone's winds, but by the shape of the bay itself. A shallow funnel that forced the ocean toward the densely populated delta. By evening, the wind had intensified, and the water in the rivers began behaving strangely. It did not retreat with the tide. Canals overflowed, waves crossed the banks, salt water pushed farther and farther into the fields. On some islands, people tried to move to higher ground, but higher ground barely existed. Much of the delta rose only a few meters above normal sea level. There were no mountains, reinforced high-rise buildings, or network of cyclone shelters capable of holding the population. There were only earthen embankments, trees, rooftops, and boats. Far too little protection for hundreds of thousands of people. Meanwhile, the cyclone was approaching the coast at the same time as high tide. Its winds pushed a vast mass of seawater ahead of it, while the narrowing Bay of Bengal compressed that water like a piston. The storm surge continued to grow. People could still hear the wind screaming outside and believed they were waiting out another severe storm. Then another sound emerged from the darkness. A continuous low roar, like an endless train approaching. It was the sea. What arrived first was not a single wave that people could see and run from. The water rose all at once, advancing as a broad moving wall. It crossed rice fields, tore boats from their moorings, and hurled them between houses like massive battering rams. Walls made of timber and mud disappeared within seconds. Roofs were lifted, overturned, and swept into the darkness with the people beneath them. The wind drove rain almost horizontally, making it impossible to tell where the air ended and the water began. Those who escaped outside grabbed palm trees, wooden beams, and floating wreckage. Parents raised children above their heads while the current tore the ground from beneath their feet. In the worst-hit areas, estimates suggest that the storm surge may have reached around 10 meters, the height of a 3-story building. For islands barely rising above sea level, that was enough for the ocean to pass over them almost without resistance. But the most terrifying moment came after the first assault. Some survivors believed the water had stopped rising. For several minutes, it may have seemed that the worst was over. Then another surge arrived, higher, faster, and filled with the wreckage of destroyed villages. Now the water itself became a weapon. Logs, rooftops, fishing boats, livestock, and entire sections of houses spun through the current. Darkness concealed each impact until the final second. Communication with the islands collapsed. Telegraph lines were severed. Radio stations went silent. Roads and docks disappeared beneath the water. Rescue teams could not reach places where tens of thousands of people were already dying. Survivors had no way to call for help and almost nowhere to climb. Some reached trees and held on for hours while branches broke under the wind and the weight of other people. Others tied family members together with ropes so the current could not separate them. Many victims were not killed directly by the cyclone's winds. They drowned when the water entered their homes while they slept. That is why Bhola became so deadly. It struck at night during high tide in one of the most densely populated and lowest-lying regions on Earth. Record-breaking winds did not decide the outcome of that night. Geography did, and the complete lack of time to escape. At dawn, the wind began to weaken, but silence did not return. Across the flooded landscape came the cries of people still clinging to trees and debris. Where villages had stood the day before, there was now only muddy water, scattered rooftops, and long trails of wreckage. Some survivors swam or waded through chest-deep water for hours, searching for children, parents, and neighbors. Fishermen whose boats remained intact became the first rescuers. They pulled people from trees, transported the injured, and returned again and again, even while the currents remained dangerous. But more often, they found people who could no longer be saved. On some islands, entire families vanished. A survivor could walk through what remained of a village without recognizing a single face. The number of victims could not be calculated immediately. Population records were incomplete. Many bodies had been carried out to sea. Some remote areas remained cut off for days. The true scale of the tragedy emerged slowly, island by island, village by village. From the air, entire sections of the delta looked as though human settlements had simply been erased from the surface of the Earth. Official estimates varied, but the number of deaths is now generally placed between 300,000 and 500,000. This made Bhola the deadliest known tropical cyclone in recorded history. Millions of people were affected. Homes, boats, crops, and livestock were destroyed, everything on which life in the delta depended. Salt water contaminated farmland and drinking water sources. Aid arrived slowly because damaged docks and the absence of roads turned the delivery of food and medicine into a separate rescue operation. But the disaster also had political consequences. East Pakistan had long felt neglected and exploited by a government based in the western part of the country. The central authorities' delayed and inadequate response intensified public anger. The cyclone was not the only cause of the coming war and the creation of an independent Bangladesh, but it exposed the deep divide between the state and millions of its citizens at the exact moment when they needed protection most. After Bhola, the world began to view tropical cyclones differently. The disaster proved that the deadliness of a storm cannot be measured by wind speed alone. Sometimes the greatest killer is barely visible on a weather map, the water that the wind lifts and drives onto the land. In the decades that followed, Bangladesh developed warning systems, volunteer networks, evacuation programs, and thousands of cyclone shelters. Later storms still caused enormous destruction, but timely evacuations saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet the story of Bhola remains a warning. The people who died that night were not simply careless, and they did not make one fatal mistake. They lived in a place where poverty, weak communications, low-lying land, and a shortage of shelters collided with the dangerous geography of the bay. A natural event became a human catastrophe because there was no reliable bridge between warning and survival. Bhola reminds us that a storm begins over the ocean, but the scale of the tragedy is determined on land, by whether people are heard, whether they are warned in time, and whether they have somewhere safe to go.